Okay, scholars, we just talked a little bit about the research method, the scientific approach to understanding our world. We talked about the different steps. We said that the first step of the research process is to define your problem, to figure out exactly what it is you want to study. Of course, that's a complex process because not only are you identifying the variables and trying to figure out how you're going to measure those variables that you think are related to each other, but you're also basing that a little bit in your theoretical perspective. If you're a conflict theorist, you're always going to focus on inequality and who has power. If you're a symbolic interactionist, you're going to focus on how the interactions between people shape behavior. If you're a structural functionalist, you're going to ask who does this benefit and how does it benefit them? And do all groups in this situation benefit from these relationships between these variables that we think are related to each other? So we define our problem. We figure out what variables we want to focus on. We go and do a review of the literature, which helps us to figure out which variables we think are important, and it may help us to refine our problem statement. We develop a hypothesis, and we're basically predicting what we think is going to happen when we analyze the data that we collect. We collect and analyze the data, that's step 4, and then we develop our conclusions from the data. We figure out what it all means. Given that we think this group did this and that's related to that, then what implications does that have for the rest of society? And we write a report and we share that with other researchers. So that's the scientific method or the research process. And we said that sociologists tend to gather data in 4 different ways. We use surveys, we use ethnographic research like participant observation and in-depth interviewing with open-ended questions and things of that nature. We do social experiments. And lastly, we use secondary analysis of data that were collected for something else, or in some cases, just historical documents. And we conduct a content analysis. We analyze the content of those writings, whether they be song lyrics or diaries or letters from someone who's, in combat. We might look at how the letters home to family differ. For those soldiers who were in World War I versus World War II versus Vietnam versus Desert Storm and Afghanistan, things like that. That would be content analysis. We're looking at documents that were produced just to connect with each other and to share our thoughts and to let people know that we're doing well and we're okay, to try to get them not to worry about us while we're off fighting in a war or whatever the case might be. So that's content analysis. You are analyzing the content of those letters and looking at the kind of information that people share. Does that change from one conflict to another? Do World War I soldiers have different reactions to warfare than, for example, Civil War combatants? And so we use those different techniques for gathering data to analyze and to try to support or fail to support our hypotheses. In the social sciences, it can be, as I mentioned to you earlier, kind of frustrating because we don't really prove anything in the social sciences. We support our hypothesis or we fail to support our hypothesis. And if we fail to support our hypothesis, then generally we start looking for reasons why our hypothesis might have been incorrect. Was the data collected in such a way that we didn't really get what we thought we were getting? Or is the theory wrong? Do we need to tweak our theory and revise it to more accurately reflect reality? Well, we talked about the code of ethics as well, and in addition to the code of ethics, there are some values and some beliefs that sociologists should have when they're conducting research. For example, there's this concept of value neutrality. And that's a term that Max Weber, remember we talked about Max Weber as talking about the subjective meanings that people had for behavior and how important that was. And so if we look at this concept of value neutrality, what Max Weber is saying is that we have to remain objective when we do our research. We all have personal thoughts and feelings about things, and we have predictions that we get tied into emotionally. If we think that our theory is the accurate theory, it's the better theory, and we're producing data that we hope supports that, even though we want our theory to be successful, we want it to be the one that people, embrace and believe, hey, yes, we believe that Mr. Harrod's theory of whatever is supported and it's a good theory. The reality is that if the data does not support that, if we get conflicting data, if we find out that, well, this is what we predicted was going to happen, but the data doesn't really support that, we have to be willing to accept those findings and continue to share those findings, even though they may not support our own pet theories. So we have to overcome our biases when we're conducting research. We have to be very, very careful about not allowing our biases to creep in and influence the way that we interpret data. That can be a challenge, but it's very important that we do so because, again, what's more important than JackHarred's theory is whether people listen to the discipline of sociology and believe that it has value and merit. And if I'm presenting data that are falsified, or I'm presenting findings that aren't really supported by the data, and people discover that, they lose their ability to believe that sociological research is valuable. And so it's very important for the science of sociology that sociologists practice this value neutrality. Yes, of course, you can have your personal belief system, and you can, but when it comes down to analyzing the data, you must remain objective and be honest about your findings, even if it doesn't support your own theories. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about how feminist methodology has changed the way sociologists are collecting and gathering data. The early sociologists, with a few exceptions, Harriet Martineau and Jane Addams and a few other notable exceptions, the majority of sociologists early on were male. And females didn't really have as central a role as they might have today. So men were developing the theories, and they were doing the research, and they were doing much of the writing. And so early sociology has a rather androcentric view. In other words, male-centered view. Most of the research tended to focus on the lives of men and the experience that they had. Now today, the feminist movement has made us more sensitive to the lives of women and the fact that there are certain things that women experience, for example, fear of sexual assault, sexual harassment. Not that men can't experience those, but many men do not have a lot of experience with things like sexual harassment and sexual assault. So that's an issue that has affected women much more than men. And therefore, there was not a lot of research early on into things like the impact of sexual assault and sexual harassment in the workplace and domestic violence and all those kinds of issues, self-harm, eating disorders. Those are all issues that tend to disproportionately affect women. Again, not saying that men can't be impacted by any or all of these things, but generally speaking, they disproportionately affect women compared to men. And so, having said that, being a victim of some kind of domestic violence or sexual assault, victimization is an area that impacts women more. And more recent contemporary sociologists and theorists have said that we really need to focus on the lives of women, that if we only focus on the lives of men, that's only 50% of the population. Actually, probably closer to 49% of the population, because women actually outnumber men slightly in the overall percentage of the population. And so if we ignore the lives of women, we're ignoring the lives and the experiences of over half of the population, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. So there are some things that have come with this focus of feminist methodology. Not only are we exploring different topics and how it affects the lives of women, but we see that they tend to look at the relationship between work and family. And they think that that's very important because, at one time, work was the realm of men. But since the 1970s, even married women who have children are very likely to work in pretty high numbers. We see that about 70% of women who are married are going to work outside the home. And so the world of work has impacted women's lives and has affected the family. The concerns about being able to provide child care for children while women are in the workforce, the relative responsibility for child care. Even though mom and dad are both working, if the children are sick, who is most likely to give up their work to take care of the children, to call in sick and to stay home with the children? Disproportionately, that has tended to fall on women because men have been seen as the breadwinners. Now, this is all changing. It's in flux, right? And I grew up at a time where, my mom stayed home with us kids until I was in high school. And that was kind of the role that women played at that time. But things were beginning to change, and eventually my mom went out into the labor force, and today she's the breadwinner. With her and my dad. My dad's retired and my mom is still working. So the roles of women have changed pretty dramatically, and it's been kind of exciting to see that, to be quite honest with you, because I've always believed that women were very capable of doing things outside the home. But let's not underestimate the importance of being a mother, being a parent, being a caregiver for children and for parents as they get older. We should never underestimate the importance of that, but we should also acknowledge that women are quite capable of contributing to the family income, just as their husbands are. And we really shouldn't encourage women to become dependent upon their husbands because sometimes husbands pass away, sometimes marriages fail, and if the woman is dependent on the male for financial resources, then that certainly puts her in a position of being somewhat subservient to the male. So the feminist methodology has made us aware that we really need to look at all of these kinds of things. It also results in researchers tending to consult their subjects more frequently. Let's ask you what kinds of questions and what kinds of issues women face, and that will help us better prepare for the questions we're going to put into our survey or into our interview schedule, so that when we ask people questions, we know what questions we need to be asking. Okay? We see that feminist researchers are also more likely to be open to multidisciplinary research. In other words, input from psychologists, early childhood development specialists, political scientists, historians. Feminist researchers tend to bring more people to the table and be more inclusive, perhaps because they understand what it means to be excluded from a conversation. And so I think that's been very beneficial, not only to feminist researchers, but to all sociological researchers, because when we see other people doing that and having success and producing good research, then it's going to encourage us to incorporate some of those methods into our research methodologies as well. And, we talked about queer theory. We talked about the fact that this theoretical position basically grew out of the conflict approach. So it's going to focus on the inequality that people experience on the basis of their gender or their sexual identity. Okay, so when we think about sexuality, that's an important part of our lives, but it's a really small part of our lives, but it can have really significant impact if we're in a group that is marginalized, if we're gay or lesbian, if we're transgender, if we're confused about our sexual identity and we don't really know who we are. You know, all of those categories of people have found themselves being treated harshly and discriminated against. In some cases, kids have come out to their family to be kicked out of their home even before graduating from high school, and kind of left to fend for themselves. And you know, I think that's certainly a horrible situation, and no one should be kicked out of their home because of their sexual identity. But you know, that goes against people's beliefs, particularly religious beliefs may prohibit homosexuality. And so, you know, we try to be understanding of everyone's beliefs, but I think most sociologists would advocate for more understanding. You know, it's not that somebody's choosing to be homosexual, because with all the hatred and the violence and the discrimination that occurs, that's a choice very few people would actually actively make. So that idea that who are gay are born that way, and it's not something that, you know, you can't go through gay conversion therapy and become heterosexual. That just doesn't seem, you know, you may be able to repress and sublimate some of those feelings and actions, but they haven't gone away in most cases, I think. And so today, most psychologists roundly criticize gay conversion therapy because it just doesn't seem to be effective, and it seems in many cases to produce more harm than good. Okay, but getting back to queer theory and methodology, the fact that you know, we need to explore people's lives other than just the heterosexuals in society makes us aware that, well, we need to look at how the, you know, the lives of people who don't share the same sexual identity that we share, that heterosexuals share. We need to try to understand their lives and be more empathetic and understanding of the conflicts that they face. And so we have to be careful about how we write our survey questions. If it excludes gay couples, then people may feel like, well, you're asking about marriage, you know, and if this research occurred before gay marriage was allowed in the United States, then people who were gay might say, well, this doesn't really apply to me because I can't get married, and therefore these questions about marriage don't really apply to me. Now, today, it's probably easier to write questions that both apply to heterosexual and homosexual couples because gay marriage is the law of the land now. And so it may be a little bit easier, but we still need to be aware that when we're asking questions about relationships, we can't just assume that our respondents are all going to be heterosexual with the idea of getting married and having children on down the road to someone of the opposite sex. We have to be aware that some of our subjects, we don't really know exactly what percentage, but some of our subjects are very likely to be homosexual or bisexual, or, you know, somehow outside what's considered to be, you know, the heterosexual norm. And a sensitivity to that can allow us to write better questions that don't discourage people from answering our surveys, and it can provide a better understanding of family life in the United States. To me, you know, family lives are changing. Yes, there's more divorce. Yes, there are more, you know, blended families. Yes, there are people choosing not to get married at all, or if they do get married, to not have children. And so, to me, family is a very important institution, and it probably always will be, and it should probably always be an important part of civilization, of American life. But it's not the only pattern that exists. That can change, and the form of family may change, but the importance of family, I don't think, is likely to change a whole lot. Parents are still going to want to socialize their young and teach them right from wrong and show them you know, the path that they think will allow their children to be happy and healthy and successful. I think that's always going to be the case. But the size of our families, the construction of our family, how we get together, you know, how we couple, you know, online dating, for example, all of that stuff, we're going to see lots of changes in the family going forward. But we're not going to see the diminishment of the family. I think the family will always be important in American society. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what your text calls the data-rich future. Since computers, personal computers were developed, we've seen an explosion in quantitative research where we're gathering all this data and we're coding it into different codes and categories and things of that nature, and we're putting that stuff in computer programs, and we're running these very complex statistical procedures to determine if there are differences between groups and what groups are there differences in, and what can we do, what does that knowledge about the differences tell us, and what are the implications. And that's wonderful. It's not the sociology that I fell in love with back as an undergraduate. I fell in love with the qualitative research where someone would go and live in a neighborhood, and a white middle class professor would go and live in a very poor minority neighborhood and become friends with people in the neighborhood and interact with people and ask them questions and eventually be accepted as a member of the community. And then they would write a book about what that experience was like in that neighborhood for the people who lived in that community. That's the sociology that really excited me as an undergraduate student, and it still excites me. But there is a place for the quantitative research where you're gathering data and plugging it into a computer and running statistical procedures to see if one group is statistically different from another or not. That still has value. They both have value, I think. But with all the data that's being collected everywhere, I mean, it's not just government entities that are collecting data about us. It's hospitals and health insurance companies and car insurance companies collect information about crashes and all that kind of stuff. So we've got all this data out there about us. And we have to be careful. If we're doing research, we have to protect the data that is in our care. We have to put it on a computer that is not linked to the internet, or if it is linked to the internet, it has adequate protections, because we're always hearing about, well, there was another data breach at Microsoft or at YouTube or at Uber or Yahoo or Ashley Madison or any of these entities that are collecting data on us. It's a very serious concern. So as a researcher, it's vital that we protect our research subjects by making sure that people can't get into our data and use it for nefarious purposes. Okay. Data is valuable. It tells us a lot. We can use data in some very, very important ways. For example, if we look at like cell phone usage during an epidemic or a pandemic, it might help us to understand the transmission of disease and where we need to focus our resources and things of that nature. But we have to make sure that we're using that for really good purposes and that we're protecting that data so that people's lives are not negatively impacted if there's a data breach. We have to do everything we can to prevent data breaches. And then if there is a data breach, we have to have made sure that we scrub the data so that there's not identifying information in the data that can then be used to harm our subjects. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some of the issues that go along with doing sociological research. For example, if you're interested in doing research into behaviors like sexual behaviors, then studying human sexuality has a number of issues. We're talking about issues that a lot of people think are very private. Today, I would say that more people are willing to talk about sexual behavior and human sexuality than a generation ago, and certainly more so than 2 generations ago. My parents and grandparents probably would not have been very open about discussing those kinds of things. Today, because we see a lot of programs where people discuss some pretty intimate issues in interviews and things of that nature, I think people are a little more open to that, but we still have a segment of our population that are uncomfortable discussing these kinds of things, and that certainly makes it a risk. Okay. Also, when we're talking about sexual issues, if we're talking about things that some people might see as abnormal behaviors, such as homosexuality or cross-dressing, or people who are transitioning from one sexual identity or one biological sex to another biological sex because they're mentality is that of the opposite sex, then those individuals have historically been targets of abuse and violence and ridicule and hatred. So it's very easy to see why people would be uncomfortable having discussions about some of those issues. So as a researcher into human sexuality, it's very difficult to conduct that research. You have a number of issues that you have to overcome, not only the reluctance of subjects to talk about or to answer questions about their sexuality, but also funding. A lot of universities are uncomfortable providing funding for research into human sexuality. And a lot of researchers are uncomfortable asking for it because they don't want to get ridiculed for getting paid by the federal government to do research on sex. It sounds like they're somehow interested in people's sexual lives, and so now they're asking for money from the federal government, taxpayer dollars, to fund their interest in other people's sexuality. Of course, that's not exactly what's going on there, but people do ridicule, people do criticize those who. I remember some research being done on bumblebees, and some people were like, "Well, why are we spending all this money on bumblebees to figure out that bumblebees can in fact fly when they shouldn't be able to fly?" And so, for something as innocuous as doing research on bumblebees, if they're getting criticized, then certainly somebody applying for a grant to do research into human sexuality is likely to receive some criticism and some bullying in some cases and things of that nature. So there's been very little comprehensive research into sexuality here in the United States. The Kinsey report that was published I believe in the late 40s. The research was started much earlier than that, but it took us till about the late 40s to get the first book published, and it's about that thick. It's a very thick volume with lots of statistics and graphs and charts, basically showing data on different sexual behaviors that the American male has engaged in. There was a subsequent book on sexual behavior in the human female that Kinsey turned out, but it took them about 12 years longer to get that volume completed and put out there. The Kinsey Institute still exists, and they're still doing research into human sexuality. But that's one of the only entities that's really doing this kind of research on a consistent basis. Of course, Masters and Johnson did some research. You might have seen the program that was kind of based on Masters and Johnson's research. They were looking at the physiological responses to arousal and things like that. In other words, the biological responses to sexual arousal. Sociologists who do research into this area are more looking at the behaviors and what kinds of socialization is associated with different types of sexual behaviors and things of that nature, and attitudes and behaviors. Okay, so federal funding is a major way that researchers get funding to support their research, but because there is this reluctance to ask for tax dollars basically to do research into human sexuality, we see that there have been other responses opening up. We see, for example, that your text talks about the Social Life Survey, the National Health and Social Life Survey, which provides private funding. And these data allow interest groups to address public policy issues, and it helps to counter some common sense notions. So there's an entity that human sexuality researchers can go to and ask for assistance in gathering their data and get some financial assistance without having to go to the federal government and ask for tax dollars. These groups, these entities have put together a number of people who are interested in funding human sexuality research, and so they can rely on that source to get some funding. Okay. What kind of research would these researchers be interested in? Well, your textbook has an example of where we looked at the most popular movies that were released in a given year, and we looked at the roles of men and women, and we evaluate how men and women are presented differently in those movies, in those very popular movies. So, for example, if you look at figure 2-5 in your textbook, women are more sexualized than men in the top films of 2016, you'll see that there are three different categories there. There's one dealing with sexy attire, there's one dealing with nudity, and there's one dealing with the focus on a character's attractiveness. Okay, so when we look at the roles that men and women play in Hollywood, we see that about 5.7% of male roles of the movies, the top films of 2016, involved men dressing in sexy attire, trying to accentuate their sex appeal. Okay, but for women, that figure was 25.9%. So for men, it was about 5.7%, a little less than 6%. For females, it was almost 26%. So women are much more likely to be dressed in sexy attire, at least in 2016, in the movies, than men were. Well, okay, so nudity. Are men and women as equally likely to show up nude in a movie? And we see that about 9.2% of the male roles in the top films of 2016, so a little less than 10%, showed male nudity. But 25.6% of those same films showed female nudity. Okay, so again, females are being presented as sexual beings more frequently than men are. And then in terms of the character's attractiveness being a center part of the movie, those top films of 2016, that happens to males 3.2% of the time, and it happens to females 10.7% of the time in those movies that were analyzed from 2016. So again, all of these statistics show us that women are more likely to be judged by their physical appearance than men are in Hollywood. And that's probably somewhat reflective of reality, right? When we think about the men and women that we come into contact with on a daily basis, we are more likely, even sociologists who are aware of this, are probably somewhat more likely to judge people on the basis, if we're looking at women, we're looking at physical attractiveness. If we're looking at men, we may be looking more at how much money do they earn? Do they have a good job? Are they financially stable? And things, are they in a leadership position? And so we're more likely to judge men on, I used to say in class that we judge women by their physical appearance and we judge men by the size of their wallets. What were you guys thinking? Okay. So yes, I think there still is something of a tendency to judge women more on the basis of their physical appeal, and somewhat more of a tendency to judge men on are they good earners or not. Okay. Now that doesn't mean that women don't look at guys and think, oh, okay, this guy's more attractive than that guy or anything like that. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that society tends to sexualize women somewhat more than we do men. Okay. And so we can also look at some research that was done on a cross-cultural basis where we look at the age of first sex based on what country people live in. And so if you look at figure 2-6, that's the median age. So 50% are older and 50% are younger. That's what the median is. It's the midpoint, okay? So when we look at these different countries, we see that in Brazil, the median age at first sex is 17.4. 50% of Brazilians were older than 17.4 and 50% were younger than 17.4 at first sex. Here in the United States, it's 18 years of age. So if you were older than 18 the first time you had sex, then you were a little older than the median, than the average. Not really the average. You were older than the median. Okay, the midpoint. If you were younger than 18, then you were younger than the median. Okay. There are other countries that are somewhat more traditional. So, for example, we look at India down there, and the median age at first sex in India is 22.9. So they tend to be a little bit slower to become sexually active than American teens, right? And certainly more so than Brazilian teens. So, I'm not making any value judgments on all of that. I'm just saying that here are the data, and we can look at it and we might wonder, why do young people in India wait later to become sexually active than people in the U.S.? And, we would probably say that it probably has something to do with the culture and the religious beliefs and the influence that parents are able to exert over their children in India. They still have some arranged marriages in India. There's still a lot of parental control, and they're more collective in their views. Americans tend to be more individualistic, right? We tend to focus more on what is it that I want as a teenager, not what do my parents want from me quite as much, okay? So I'm going to talk very briefly about some different statistics that we will use in this class. I've mentioned the median, the midpoint. We use that a lot of times instead of the actual average, which is the mean. We use the median sometimes when we know that we're looking at data where extreme scores can skew the average. Okay, so for example, let's say that we're looking at income and we've got 10 people, Mark Cuban and 9 other people, and we want to know what the average income is for that group. Well, if we just take everybody's last year's income and we put that down and we average it among those 10 people, Mark Cuban's going to kind of mess up our numbers, right? Because we know he probably made several hundreds of millions last year, perhaps. I don't know, 50 million. I don't know what Mark Cuban would pay income taxes on an annual basis, but certainly he's not typical, right? So if we include his data in there and we use the mean, the average, then it's going to look like everybody's making a couple of $100,000 a year, and we know that's probably not an accurate representation. But if we use the median or the midpoint, we can look at what the median family income is, and maybe let's say it's $25,000, and half of the subjects in our research are below that and half the subjects are above that. That's a more meaningful understanding of what the typical family looks like than looking at the average income. So the mean will sometimes not be used, even though it can be a very helpful, if we're looking at a class grade. If we take exam 1 and I'm looking at the grade and I look at the average, and the average is 89. I'm probably going to be pretty happy with that, right? And I think the class will be pretty happy with that because chances are in a class with 23 people or so in it, if you've got an average of 89, most people did pretty well on that. There might have been a few that brought the average down. Maybe you just had one student who just froze up and couldn't complete the test and turned it in and got a 0. Maybe the average would have been an A for everybody had that one person not done so poorly, right? So that's why we use the median, the midpoint, in cases where we've got some extreme scores that can kind of skew our results if we just use an average or the mean. Okay, so we've talked about the median and the mean. There's also another statistic that we use, measure of central tendency. We call these measures of central tendency, and it's the mode. The mode is the most frequently occurring score. So if I give a test and 5 people scored 95 on it, and only 2 or 3 scores were at 92, 91, 88, whatever. But 5 people, that's the most frequently occurring score. 5 people scored 95, then that would be the mode. Now, you've all seen the normal curve, the bell-shaped curve, that goes something like that. And we know that on each end, it's a very small percentage of the population that do really poorly or really well. And most of us are kind of lumped up in the middle. With a normal curve, your mean, median, and mode are centered around the same values. They're kind of close to each other. But if you get a skewed distribution where there's a whole bunch of people up at the top, then your mean, median, and mode tend to have more difference between them. We also can talk about standard deviation, and the standard deviation is the average distance of a score from the average, okay? And if you've got a real small standard deviation, that means that most people scored close to the average. If you've got a larger standard deviation, then that means that there's more spread to your distribution. People are more scattered out. You had more high and low values, and people are further away from the mean or the average, right? So standard deviation is another useful thing. The smaller the standard deviation, the closer the scores are to the average. We will also talk about frequencies. And frequencies are just when you add up all the people that made an A, all the people that made a B, all the people that made a C, all the people that made a D, all the people that made an F, and you list out, okay, I had 5 A's, I had 8 B's, 4 or 5 C's, a couple of D's, and 1 F. That's a frequency distribution. You're distributing those into different categories, and you're summarizing the data. And so we use a lot of frequency distributions. We show that, Democrats feel this way about the legalization of marijuana, Republicans feel this way about it, and so on and so forth. And now we're getting into not just frequency distributions, but when we add in the political affiliation, now we're creating a crosstab table. So we might have attitudes towards legalization, yes and no, and then we've got it split out by Republicans and Democrats. So we've got an extra variable that we've added in there that we are using to crosstab the table. And so you'll see a 2x2 or a 3x2 crosstab table that shows people's attitudes broken down on different variables. And that's very useful data. If a well-constructed table can really communicate a lot to the reader, they say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. I would say that a good graphic depicting data is worth 10,000 words if it's a good one, okay? Because you can really summarize data. You can make it understandable for people by just building a good table and representing that data, summarizing it, and breaking it down for people so that they get a good understanding of what the data was showing in the research when you gathered it, okay? Percentages are just the percentage out of 100%. So if 40% say this and 60% say that, it adds up to 100%. And you can see how people's opinions vary depending on what groups they belong to. Some important groups, the age categories, socioeconomic status. Upper class people probably see the world somewhat differently than working class and lower class people. Just as there's differences between the upper class and the middle class, right? And so we'll look at all these kinds of tables. We'll look at statistics throughout the text. I encourage you, there's a tendency, I think, when reading a chapter to skip over the pictures and the charts and the tables and the graphs. I really recommend, if you want to do well in this class, I think it's important that you look at the tables that are included, because those tables are included to demonstrate the data that's being shared with you or the information that's being shared with you in the text of the chapter. So don't skip those boxes. Don't skip those graphics. You might skip them when you read through the first time, but then come back and look at them, and then look at the text of the surrounding that box and try to figure out why the author put that graphic in there. It wasn't just to take up space and to, give you a break from reading. It was there to demonstrate something in the text and to make it easier to understand and to show you what they're trying to tell you. Because we know that some people are very visual learners, some people are more auditory learners, and they need to hear it. Most of us use a bit from each different, some of us have to do things, put our hands on things to learn. Most of us use a combination of those methods. We need to hear it, we need to see it, we need to repeat it, we need to do it. And if we see it visually and we hear it, then that helps us, that repetition can help us to take that information in and make use of it. Okay, I think that's about what I have for chapter 2. And so now we've made it through the first chapter, where I talked about what sociology is. I talked about the 3 sociological perspectives. I talked about it being a science and why it's a science. And then in chapter 2, we got into how we go about doing that research and developing that science of human behavior. and human attitudes. So hopefully you have you're feeling good about the material that we've covered so far. If not, please send me questions. Chances are, if you have a question about something, your classmates also have a question about it, because chances are, if I didn't explain something adequately for you, then I probably didn't explain it well enough for other students to understand it either. So don't hesitate to contact me with questions. I'll be setting up our blog where I will pose questions, and you guys hopefully will contribute to the blog, and you'll be able to ask some of your questions, and I'll answer those questions for the class, and or we'll kick them around. Maybe I won't answer them. Maybe I'll ask you what the class thinks, and we'll get some feedback and discussion going on there. So be on the lookout for the blog. But today is the first day officially of classes. So I'm recording this on Tuesday the 7th. So yes, we're just getting started, but if there are questions or issues, we need to address those early in the semester, not in week 3 or 4, when things have gone far enough that it's hard to turn them around. So please, by all means, contact me. I've already been in contact with some of you via email and maybe even a couple of text messages. So keep it up, guys. I enjoy getting the comments and questions. I see that you're watching the videos. I get an update on how many of you have watched the videos. So please make use of the videos and read. For those of you that have your textbooks, please be reading the chapters. For those of you that are still waiting for them to come in, hang in there. I will work with you on timing of exams and things of that nature. It wouldn't be fair to give you an exam over material you haven't been able to study for yet. So, but if you'll watch the videos, and I'll be uploading the PowerPoints, I'll also be uploading the study guide for exam 1. And so look at all that stuff, look it over, familiarize yourself with the PowerPoints, watch the videos, do the reading if you've got the textbook, watch Crash Course Sociology videos. Those are tremendous. I can't recommend them highly enough. Nicole Sweeney does a good job. She talks really fast, faster than I do. But she does a great job of explaining some really complex issues. So make use of those videos as well as my videos, and be on the lookout for chapter 3, which deals with culture. We're going to start talking about culture, and then we'll have our first exam, and then we'll get into socialization, and which kind of is a continuance of what we're talking about in chapter 3 when we talk about culture. So have a great day, guys, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.